and Sacramento's 2040 General Plan. What does it mean? And as I said, this presentation is being put on by Preservation Sacramento, of which I am currently the president of the board. So this is an update to the City of Sacramento's general plan. It has been in process for about a year and a half now. This started in, well, almost 2 years. It started in 2018, 2019, right after the Central City Specific Plan was being finished. And then there were a series of public workshops and events in 2019, and then virtual workshop events in 2020. As a response to the pandemic, they were still being held, but they were being held online. So today we want to talk about what a general plan is, why we need one, what exactly is being proposed, what are its effects, and what do community groups think, and what can we do as individuals, as neighbors, as members of the public, and as organizations. Sacramento's city planning dates back to the gold rush when John Sutter Jr. paid Captain William Warner and Lieutenants Ord and Sherman to draw up a plan for his father's land alongside the Sacramento River. This we used a very standard grid pattern that you see here, and you can see the original mouth of the Sacramento River, or the American River, the Sacramento River along the southern end, and the Sutter's Fort all the way up towards the top at the eastern end of the city. But most of the growth, as any of you who follow Sacramento history know, started at the waterfront and then gradually moved east. The river itself was moved. That was part of our planning that came later. But originally, it was fairly minimal rules as far as what you could do. You couldn't build a road in the street, but if you owned a lot, you could pretty much do what you wanted on it. Within a few years, the city found out that, oh yeah, it floods. So there were measures taken to build levees to protect us. And then a few years later, people realized that a city made entirely of wood burns really well. So we had two major fires in 1852 and 1854. So we started requiring that downtown buildings be made of brick. So those early efforts also included some of our first racial rules and quite frankly racist rules, because we had a large Chinese population, and essentially the city fathers said that the Chinese should live along what was then called Lake Sutter and later got the name China Slough because that was where our Chinatown was located. Essentially, this community was forced to live alongside what was by then a swamp. And in the 20th century, Sacramento started building new suburbs and redeveloping portions of the city. And the first one that had specific rules that we would call zoning today: limitations on uses, requirements for setbacks, maximum building heights, and other standards for what the neighborhood should look like in advance of its construction in Boulevard Park. Now, this was the site of the California State Fairgrounds from the 1860s until the early 1900s. And when it was moved to Stockton and Broadway, it was redeveloped using the latest in 20th century design techniques. And that included paved streets, which was something new. Previously, the streets of a suburb were pretty much just bare dirt, and sidewalks that were already constructed, and connections to city sewer systems, and then a series of design rules. And you can see here from the lower end on H Street, closest to the streetcar line, to the upper ends off C Street near the Southern Pacific Railroad, the lots go from relatively large to smaller and more compact. And this was deliberate. The southern end was more desirable. It was close to the streetcar. It was where everybody could see it. And so they assumed that this is where wealthier people would purchase houses. And then as you go north, then smaller lots where working people, generally working professionals and lower middle class folks, could still afford to buy a lot and live alongside their neighbors who were more wealthy. There were not, so far as I know, racial covenants on this property or on these properties. I'm told there have been some found, but when Boulevard Park was originally laid out in about 1905, there wasn't really a whole lot of racial covenants that we'll talk about later that were in place. But During this period, the early 1900s, Sacramento was filling up and expanding. As I mentioned, we flooded, we had levees around the entire city, so it was like a fort with a gigantic moat. And we started to expand to the lower right-hand corner into what was originally called Highland Park, which, if you're a city that floods, calling a neighborhood Highland is a good marketing technique. And then Oak Park, commonly known as Sacramento's first suburb, in the lower right-hand corner. Now, these early suburbs were streetcar suburbs. They had their own car lines, originally drawn by electric battery-powered cars, and then mule-drawn streetcars before they had overhead trolley wires. And they were more flexible, and they did not have racial covenants. But what happened is that I don't think that white folks in those days thought that people of color would ever buy into their suburbs. But Sacramento had a growing black middle class, small but energetic, and some of them did buy. George Dunlap bought land in Oak Park for his family home, and you can see his daughters on the left, who later became the waitstaff in Dunlap's dining room, his most legendary restaurant. Reverend T. Allen Harvey opened the first African American church in a suburb in Oak Park. Previously, the African American community was mostly centered on what was called the West End, in between Capitol Park and the river, south of Chinatown. And then to the right, that's Ernesto Galarza, who later became very well known as a labor activist. His family also lived in the West End, as did many immigrants from Mexico in the early 20th century who were escaping the Mexican Revolution, a lot of war and conflict there. And then they moved to Oak Park. And this was met with tremendous resentment by whites, and it was a national thing. This is not something that unique to Sacramento, but about 1910, 1920, through the 50s, really, suburban developers started putting on what was called racial exclusion covenants. Now, these were not officially zoning. This was not something that was condoned by city or state. In fact, in California, there were parts of the country where racial zoning was allowed in the South until the Supreme Court threw it out, but it was considered a private contract. So it's just between the seller and the buyer. The government didn't have to be involved. And so racial exclusion covenants became very common in every suburb, almost every suburb. They prohibited sales to people of color. Very often they would prohibit sales in the earliest days to Catholics. You had to be Protestant, so you couldn't be Jewish or Catholic or Orthodox and buy into these subdivisions. Later on, they became limited more broadly to whites only. But all of Sacramento's suburbs, like I said, or almost all of them, had these racial covenants. And one of the reasons being put forth by the city of Sacramento for the 2040 general plan update is recognizing this history of exclusion and aiming for a more inclusive city. Now, general plans for the city have often been more about the 10,000-foot view. This was a plan that was paid for by Sacramento's Chamber of Commerce by a famous landscape architect named John Nolan. And he proposed taking Sacramento's streets and turning some of them into grand boulevards and creating diagonals throughout the city in order to create different angles from which to view the Capitol. But he didn't take into account a whole lot of what was already on the ground. And so this high-level view, where planners look down on the city from 50,000 feet but don't necessarily notice what's on the sidewalks, is a common critique of general plans. We're going to talk more about that later. Their vision for the area between the state capitol and the Sacramento River was for a grand entrance, a plaza and park with broad avenues and government buildings. Then here are two examples of those. The problem is, number one, there wasn't a way to pay for this kind of really extensive and very expensive redevelopment. Number two, as I mentioned, this was Sacramento's African American community, and it's a Latino community. Ernie Galarza and his family lived on L Street, and then also it's Japantown. Sacramento in the early 20th century was, we didn't have the largest Japantown, but we were by population one of the most Japanese cities in the nation. And so this very significant group of migrants, of immigrants, of people of color and this very vibrant neighborhood were effectively in the way of modern city planning. A big change came in the 1930s. A Depression era recovery program, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and this is associated with Federal Housing Administration and other ways to encourage homeownership through government-sponsored loans, it was created in order to assess risk in neighborhoods. Which neighborhoods are a safe bet for a mortgage? Which ones are higher risk? Are there problems in the neighborhood that might make it riskier? And many of those were physical. Is it near factories or other industrial uses, near railroads, near environmental risks? But the biggest factor was generally race. And so this is a redlining map, as they're called, of Sacramento. This was done in the 30s. And the areas in red are areas that are considered redlined, and that this is not a place where you can get a home loan from the government. And because banks took these government maps as official, they were not a place that you could get a home loan, period. Very often the yellow areas in the map, it was much harder to get a home loan. They were more expensive. And so you can see that the West End that I mentioned, the area between Capitol Park and the Sacramento River, was redlined, as well as Southside Park, Alkali Flat, and Mansion Flat. The northern edge of the central city through Boulevard Park, which, as I mentioned, is considered a pretty fancy neighborhood. And then the yellow zone covered most of the central city and even parts of East Sacramento and Oak Park. The blue areas that you see and the green areas, those are areas that were considered a safer bet because the population was white and they had racial covenants. Yes, Oak Park had some racial covenanted sections, and they were considered lower risk, easier to get loans because, again, because of the race of the population that was there. Now, the population of the central city, as I mentioned, you have your Japanese American community, the Latino community, which continued to grow during the course of the 20th century. And then a new method to change cities came forth. It was called redevelopment. It was originally authorized in 1947, but by legislation that was intended to replace a lot of neighborhoods that were, to be honest, in pretty rough shape. The Great Depression and World War II meant there were massive shortages of materials. There wasn't a whole lot that could be built, and a lot of American neighborhoods were in tough straits. And so redevelopment was envisioned as a way to repair them and provide housing. But the problem is nobody wanted to do it because if you kept the population there that was causing the redlining, the communities of color, then the neighborhoods would still be redlined and you couldn't get loans. So that changed in 1954 when a new set of rules came in for redevelopment, what was called the businessmen's redevelopment, where you didn't need to keep the population there. And Sacramento became one of the first places where this was done. It was marketed initially via a vote of the citizens of Sacramento, and it was turned down. So the city used a new method called tax increment financing to do it. And when they were trying to promote the vote, this was the kind of editorial cartoon that was created. The people who opposed redevelopment were assumed that they're blind, they can't see, they're ignoring problems, and you can see explicitly the racial character that redevelopment had. This is the people of the neighborhood were responsible for the creeping blight, as it was called. Blight is it's an imaginary disease of buildings caused by the occupants being economically disadvantaged or people of color, and the only perceived solution was demolition. Redevelopment was approved, and the West End no longer exists, except for a handful of buildings. The people who escaped that demolition moved to new neighborhoods. As I mentioned, Oak Park was what became one of those places, a neighborhood of exodus. But what happened is, because redlining was still in place when this was happening in the 1950s and 1960s, Oak Park became redlined, even as new construction was going on. The Shiloh Baptist Church, originally at 6th and P Street, moved to 7th Avenue and built a new building designed by Sacramento's first African-American architect, James Dodd. It's currently not only a Sacramento landmark, but listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Another major change in city planning happened in the 1950s, also during the redevelopment era, where new state legislation in California required that every city have a general plan. That's what we're talking about today, is general plans for how we build and develop cities. And this is the neighborhood land trends from the 60s. And the assumption was that the bulldozers that had demolished the West End would keep going pretty much all the way to Alhambra Boulevard. And they would be replaced, the neighborhoods would be replaced by high density residential. There would be a handful of low density residential areas where some of the architectural treasures of the city would be retained, but for the most part, it was all going away because nobody really wanted to live downtown. And the assumption was that most of it was going to be offices, and people would live in the suburbs and take these wonderful new freeways to get downtown. By the 1980s, people realized that the wonder of the freeways was wearing off, and we were starting to look at other things like light rail as means to carry people downtown. But the general plans of the 1980s and 90s, like this one, were still very much focused on what's called Euclidean land use. There's a famous Supreme Court case, Euclid versus Ambler, which gave cities the ability to zone. And generally, it was a flat zoning model where the retail or commercial is in one place, the industry is in another place, and the residences are in a third place, and preferably very low density, very preferably single family homes. In part because of, again, that FHA policy. Federal Housing Administration didn't want to provide loans for people who were in very dense neighborhoods or small apartments. They wanted single family homes. And so that became the predominant housing form, not because it was necessarily called for by the market. The streetcar suburbs of the early 20th century were very market driven with very few rules about them, but the suburban expansion of the 50s that followed World War II was very much what I would call a social experiment. The assumption that housing should be in single family homes, even if it excludes many people because they can't get into those neighborhoods because of racial covenants, and they can't improve their own neighborhoods because they're redlined and they can't get loans to fix them up. And then this is a more recent, this is the 2030 general plan. This is the plan that we're updating. And racial exclusion covenants were declared illegal on a statewide basis in 1967, another Supreme Court case. So they couldn't stop people of color from buying property, but they could limit the density of that property. And again, FHA prefers larger lots. And so on this map, this is an urban form diagram of the current city plan. And you can see most of it is this light yellow color. That's suburban neighborhood low and traditional neighborhood low, maximum 8 units an acre. Generally 3 to 8. So almost all single family homes. In certain situations, you can do duplexes on corners, but that's really the predominant housing form that is allowed in almost all of the city. And you'll notice that the colors get more intense as you head downtown. The central city has this orange color, which is generally it's called urban neighborhood medium or traditional neighborhood medium, which is the kind of density we're going to be talking about more later today, the missing middle. But one thing about this map is that it kind of looks a little familiar, doesn't it? It's like, look where the brightest colors are, and then look at that redlining map again. The highest intensity uses are in the areas that were previously redlined, and the lower intensity uses are in the places that were previously segregated. Now, I mentioned missing middle housing a little while ago, and what missing middle is are housing forms that have long been part of American cities, have long been part of Sacramento's neighborhoods, but they are prohibited in those low density suburban neighborhoods. So on the left, we have detached single family homes. In the middle, we have some kind of the places that might seem a little unusual, but they still look about the same size as single family homes, and that's very deliberate. Duplexes, where there's 2 levels or side by side, fourplexes, where there's 4 units, or you can plex all the way up to a 12plex if you want, but generally the 2 duplex, fourplexes, and sixplexes are the most common. And then courtyard apartments or bungalow courts, where you have a cluster of small buildings around a common courtyard, are another missing middle form that's very popular, and they're generally 1-story buildings. townhouses where you have multiple buildings that are either physically connected by a party wall or very close together, and then multiplexes or small live workspaces where, say, there's a store, a retail store downstairs and housing upstairs. And then you go beyond that, you get into mid-rise apartment buildings and more urban forms that are outside the realm of missing middle. And generally, for the past half century, we've built stuff that's all the way on the left, detached single-family houses, or very large apartment buildings, or in the suburbs, more what we call garden apartments that are also still very large, rather than a small apartment that fits on a single house lot and from first glance looks like a single-family home. Pardon me, I've got the tea so I don't get too many frogs in my throat. But this is the land use map. This is the 2040 land use map, and you can see that there are a smaller number of colors here, and that's very deliberate. There were 27 different land use categories in the 2030 plan. What the 2040 update wants to include is only 11. So instead of suburban neighborhood, low, medium, high, and traditional neighborhood, low, medium, high, there's just neighborhood. And what that means is this is where you find houses and relatively small number of businesses, or if there are businesses, they're generally neighborhood serving businesses. And then instead of a multiplicity of different urban styles, mostly they just want to call it residential mixed use. And this is mostly what we'd call commercial. And commercial zoning is very common in Sacramento along business corridors. And what they want to make clear is that Sacramento is kind of unique. A lot of cities don't allow this, but we allow residential construction on commercial zone properties by right. You don't have to ask special permission to build an apartment building where there used to be a supermarket. It's already allowed. And so changing that general form to RMX makes sense because you're making it clear this isn't just for commercial, but also for residential. But it does mean the intensity is higher. We talked about those red colors before. That's generally where you have the higher buildings, taller building heights. And that is measured with a separate map that goes with the land use map called Proposed Maximum Development Intensities. And again, they have this initial FAR, floor area ratio. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But for now, you can see that most of the city has this nice sort of light tan color, and then as you get closer to downtown, closer to the business corridors, it gets more of a pink and then more of a deep red or burgundy red downtown. And so that's generally the maximum intensity, the maximum number of stories, or the maximum ratio of floor area of lands to floor area. Now, this is floor area. A floor area ratio is the ratio of the building's square footage to the land on which it sits. So if we've got a plot of land that's, say, 5,000 square feet, and the maximum FAR is 1, then you can build, theoretically, a one-story, 5,000 square foot building. But you can't necessarily do that. We talked a little bit earlier about things like setbacks, where you can't build all the way to the sidewalk, or space between buildings, and essentially you can't build property line to property line in a neighborhood. You can do it in a commercial area, but in a neighborhood, generally you're going to have more like the picture in the middle, where half of the land is lawn or open space, and then you have a 2-story building on that lot. You can build less. You don't have to build all the way up to maximum intensity, but you can build within that envelope. And then theoretically, in some places, you could build a 4-story building that covers a quarter of the lot. The problem is that in addition to setbacks, you also have maximum heights. In the neighborhood areas, for the most part, that's 35 feet, whereas in a commercial neighborhood, or in the RMX area, that can go up to 85 feet. And so that's more what you'd find in Midtown along our commercial corridors or commercial areas, but what you're more likely to find in neighborhoods with a floor area ratio of 2, which, as you can see here, is pretty much just within the central city and Oak Park and a few other parts of town, like along Del Paso Boulevard. And again, so I see you're putting the most intense land uses along the neighborhoods that used to be redlined, principally still communities of color. Here's some examples of FAR1, and in most of the city of Sacramento, this is what to expect if these changes go through. There's a bungalow court, one of my favorites in East Sacramento. There are single-family homes that you can see here in Curtis Park, in Midtown, in Poverty Ridge. And they're generally two-story homes that have some space in the front and some space in the back, occupying the other half of the lot. So if we're talking about FAR1, this is what we're talking about. The difference is that they don't have to only be single-family homes. These can also be duplexes or fourplexes that look about the same. FAR2, again, this is more of the central city area. These are examples of properties that occupy most or all of their lot. This example on top is in Boulevard Park, and on the left is a single family home. Oh no, actually, I'm sorry, I corrected. It looks like maybe it's a duplex, but it's got two doors side by side. And that building probably has an FAR of 1 because it has a backyard behind it. On the right, we have the very common Central City fourplex with the mansard roof. And they're not very pretty, but they're a very efficient use of space. They occupy almost all of their lot, and there's 4 apartments, and so it has an FAR of 2. On the lower left, you see another example of that FAR2 fourplex, in this case, in a little bit prettier design. And then it's also used for modern urban infill. On the lower right, we see a development on R and 26th Street, which is originally zoned, like I said, R3A, that traditional neighborhood medium that allowed missing middle buildings. And these are row houses separated only by a few feet, 2 stories tall, except the ones on the corner are 3. And they're single family separate homes that are for sale. These got built very quickly and they got sold very quickly. And they don't sell very often. They were a very popular product. Then there's the FAR of 3, and this is too big for most of the city. So if you're worried this is going to be in your neighborhood, if you don't live in any of those FAR 3 or higher areas, you're not likely to see these dreadfully humongous 3-story buildings. And these are both Midtown sixplexes. And to give you some context, here's the sixplex that you just saw on the right with an FAR of 3. On the far left is a duplex with an FAR of 2. These buildings, they have very small backyards. There's a parking lot behind them. And then the 2 buildings in the middle, that 2-story building and the 1-story building, again, those are the kinds of sizes of buildings that would be allowed in the rest of the city if this passes. Now, what's the FAR of this building? Its floor area ratio, it looks pretty tall. It's 9 stories. So the FAR is 9, right? And well, no, because it has a large parking lot and a setback in front. So it really only occupies about a third of its lot. So this has an FAR of 3, despite being 3 times as tall as that FAR 3 building that we saw here. And this was a mid-century design. It's public housing. It would be a little bit taller than would be allowed in our business corridors. And because of parking requirements in the 70s, when this was built, it was assumed that you'd need lots of parking. It resembles the work of an architect named Le Corbusier, who called this style towers in the park, but other wags who realized that you needed to have lots of cars there called them towers in a parking lot. And the requirements of parking are partially why buildings are so massive. In some cases, it's so tall because you need to make room for those parking spaces and you need to spend money to build the parking. Now, the other big category we talked about is RMX and what sort of buildings go there. That's generally between 6 and 8 stories tall, but they can go much taller. The downtown RMX zones have a maximum floor area ratio of 15, so really the sky's the limit there. And that's good. That's where the tall buildings are supposed to go. These mid-rise buildings have some real pluses, though. People will talk about high rises and that high rise housing with steel frames is really what we need in the long run to pack people in. But there's some nice things about mid rises. Number one, they're mostly made of wood, which means it's a more sustainable, greener material. They are less expensive to build. So the rents, while they're still high, new construction is very expensive. And guess what? A lot of our wood just caught on fire. It catches on fire every year, which means it's getting a little harder to get, but it's still cheaper than steel. And then it also works in our existing business neighborhoods. So it also, even though they're shorter than high rises, the units tend to be smaller, so you can actually get quite a bit of housing, 100 to 150 units an acre. So we talked about those suburban neighborhoods originally. They're about 8 units an acre. Central City is about 35 units an acre. These are 100 to 150, so they could bring a lot of housing to places that don't have them very quickly, and they're becoming very popular. You're seeing them pop up all over the city, not just in the Central City. We're seeing a bunch near Sac State for student housing. And this is what the neighborhood housing form looks like. We talked a lot about these. Some are some are single family homes. Some are multifamily, some are for sale, and others are for rent. They have a variety of different types and styles. The heights generally within the envelope of what wouldn't be considered too inappropriate for a single family home. And one thing to remember is that these changes do not forbid construction of single family homes. If you have a lot and you want to build a home for one family, you certainly can. There's no prohibition. But if you want to build a multifamily building and it's within the same envelope that you can build that single family home, the new rules say that yes, you can build it, and there's less requirements for parking. Not zero, not none, unless you happen to be, there are a couple of exceptions. If you're in the central city, pretty much you don't have to put parking on anything. If you're near transit, then parking requirements are zero. But if you want to sell that property, if you want to rent that luxury loft, you pretty much need to provide a place for the customer to park their car. The difference is it is the developer's choice how many parking spaces go there instead of a government bureaucrat's choice. We're not getting away from the cars yet, not for a long time. So we're going to need to make some account for them, but we don't need to invent parking ratios because they're not really based on anything. They really are something that perhaps should be based more on market demand than the government telling me how many parking spaces each unit needs. So what does this have to do with affordability? Because that's the whole idea, is making housing more affordable, right? Well, there's a couple of simple equations to follow here. And the most common idea is that if you build more housing, then it becomes less expensive. Supply and demand. Provide more supply, and you meet the demand. The problem is, as we talked about, new housing is expensive, so it's inherently going to cost more than older existing housing. Older housing tends to be cheaper because it is less in demand, and not necessarily historic homes here. We're talking about buildings that are 40, 50, 60, 70 years old, that are 20, 30 years old, that aren't necessarily the coolest thing anymore, but they're not necessarily something that people immediately recognize as, oh, that's a historic house. It's valuable and cool. And filtering also means that if you build this expensive new housing, then the people with the most money will move into the expensive housing. And that means you're taking some of the market pressure off the people in the less expensive older housing. This is well and good. However, studies have shown that while this works, it's very slow. It can take decades for filtering to really take effect, which doesn't mean much comfort for people who need housing now to say, well, in 20 or 30 years, there will be plenty of housing for your children. Until then, good luck. Creating new housing also has other effects in a neighborhood. Is while the rents of smaller, older buildings may be lower, if you build new housing in a neighborhood, it sends a signal to the owners of those properties, whether they're renters or buyer, or whether they're a landlord or a single property owner, that, hey, this new housing in my neighborhood is more expensive than mine, and people are paying it. So that means my property is more valuable. I can charge higher rent or get a higher price for my house. And that reduces the effectiveness of filtering. Also, in order to get filtering, you need to keep the old housing. So if you say, I want to build this new building and there's this old housing in the way, so we're going to demolish it because we're still mathematically going to have more, right? There's a problem with that, because while you're still ending up with more units than you started with, instead of adding the existing housing to what you just built, you're subtracting it. So instead of building this big building, you're actually building a smaller building minus the buildings that you demolished. And because they're all new construction, they're all more expensive. You lose the benefits of filtering whenever you demo housing. Doesn't mean you have to save every house, but it means the demolition of existing housing has to be done very carefully and with very careful consideration. So what do we do? And one other thing that happens is if, for example, you have an area well, I want to build this really tall, really expensive building in an area that's predominantly low rise, then the buildings are small. Now that means that the owners of those small buildings go, well, this guy built a huge building, which means that the land underneath my buildings is worth a lot more than the buildings on top of them. So we're going to do whatever we can to get these buildings out of the way so we can build an expensive building too. And maybe they do have the money for it, and maybe they don't. And a lot of the for those of you who spend a lot of time downtown, you see these vacant lots or vacant buildings that are just sitting there and seems like they're not doing anything. It's because the owner is probably, they don't want to do anything with the building. They don't want to occupy it. They don't want to spend a penny to fix it because they're hoping that either they'll get permission to knock it down, or it'll just kind of happen by accident, and they can build the thing they wanted to put there in the first place, which they may or may not ever have the money to do. This is called demolition by neglect, and a lot of cities have specific regulations about it, and things like vacancy taxes or requirements for minimum maintenance standards to limit that. And Sacramento, for the most part, doesn't. Also, then the other strategy, we're going to talk a lot about preservation because we're a preservation organization, is preservation plus infill. And we talked about demolishing older buildings. If the buildings are historic buildings, they're harder to demolish. So they're easier to keep. So if you build infill in a historic neighborhood, on vacant lots, in alleys, on commercial corridors, using what are called the non-contributors in a historic district, which are buildings that are too new or too altered to count as historic buildings anymore, then you do get the benefits of filtering. Preservation plus infill is a positive growth strategy in that it allows more housing without undue disruption of the existing housing, which means you maintain that affordability, but you also provide room for the wealthier folks who want the new expensive housing. Another strategy is preservation plus affordable infill. In many cities, they require a certain percentage of all housing that is constructed to be affordable. And that means, so in addition to the expensive units, you also have cheaper units. And instead of the nearby landlord saying, well, that's an all luxury building, so my neighborhood should be all luxury too, and I can raise the prices, having a percentage of affordable means that it's not all luxury. So that signal to market that you've undervalued the land is reduced. And in conjunction with preservation, that actually can be a good strategy that protects the neighborhoods and protects rents while allowing new construction. And there's a very common misconception about historic properties that they're much more expensive. And the city of Los Angeles, or actually the LA Conservancy, that's our parallel organization. The LA Conservancy is LA's citywide preservation organization, just did a study called Preservation Positive Los Angeles. The URL is on the top of this, and I'll post it into the chat later. But they hired Donovan Rickema, who is a preservation economist, to look at the city of LA. And the city of LA did a project called Survey LA, where they surveyed every single building in Los Angeles built since 1980 to figure out which ones were historic and which ones were not. And so they could have a really good baseline for the effects of historic preservation on the economics of housing. And what they found was apartments in Los Angeles, the older they were, the cheaper they were. Like we talked about, filtering, older housing gets cheaper. You can see by this chart, stuff built after 2000, very expensive. 1960 to 1999, still pretty expensive. The sweet spot is sort of between the 20s and the 60s. And older than that, those are buildings that are so old that they're really generally recognized as historic and special. And so they command a premium price because they are so rare, because they are so sought after. But for the most part, you have the most of the older buildings are cheaper than the new buildings and the oldest buildings. They also found that rental affordability was higher in their historic districts. They call them HPOZs, Historic Preservation Overlay Zones. We call them historic districts, but it's basically the same thing. Another thing that's different that we'll talk about is Sacramento's historic districts tend to be far more renter heavy. But you can see here that in Los Angeles, a city that's not necessarily known for its cheap land or its cheap rents, the HPOZs, the historic districts, are where you find more affordable units. More people in LA can afford to live there. We talk a lot about gentrification, displacement of communities from less wealthy populations to more wealthy populations. And so this map was generated showing the HPOZs in light blue and gentrified areas in orange. And we can see that there's a few places where the historic districts and the gentrified areas overlap, but for the most part, they do not. So being a historic district does not necessarily trigger gentrification. I also found that these were among the most diverse neighborhoods in Los Angeles, and generally people who lived in HPOZs were less likely to be white than in the rest of the city. So it's not so historic preservation doesn't necessarily cause displacement of communities of color. Household incomes, pretty close to each other, whether you were in an HPOZ or not. So the idea that these are enclaves of the wealthy is not necessarily the case in Los Angeles. And you can see generally people in HPOZs make a little bit less, not a lot less, but they're pretty comparable. They're also more dense. As we talked about, these older streetcar neighborhoods included that missing middle housing in addition to single family homes, whereas newer properties and places that aren't necessarily considered historic districts tended to be more strictly single family. So the population density is higher in historic districts than outside of them. And the zoning of the property reflects that. HPOZs are more likely to be zoned for multifamily than single family than the rest of the city. Property value, you can see here the size of old buildings tends to be smaller. Buildings used to be a lot smaller. In 1950, the average size of a new home was around 600 square feet. Now it's closer to 2,000. People, yeah, physically they were smaller. This was before the invention of the Big Mac, of course. And new housing builders tend to like a dramatic entrance and large entryways and things that take up a lot of space because OSB construction materials are cheap and the rest of the house is expensive. But what we find here is while the average value of an HPOZ, of a historic home in an HPOZ is less, because the house is smaller, the average value cost per square foot is slightly less rather than being more. So the idea that historic buildings are necessarily more expensive than modern construction is also not necessarily true based on the numbers. People in HPOZs in historic districts tend to ride transit more often because these are streetcar suburbs that still have good bus service or light rail service. And they also have room to grow, where one of the things that's become really popular is alley units. Accessory dwelling units. New state legislation requires that this is allowed everywhere, and Sacramento has passed rules to allow it. And because a lot of the single family properties in LA's historic districts have less than 40% lot coverage, this is, again, if you have an FAR of 1, you've got a 2-story building that covers half the lot, you've got room in the back to build an ADU and add more housing. So historic districts in LA are affordable, diverse, and dense. A similar study has not yet been done in the city of Sacramento. I'd love to, it's just we don't have the money to hire Donovan Rickman. LA Conservancy, they're a great organization, but they're a little better funded than us. And you can see that most of the city of LA is single family residences, 85%. But in HPOZs, only about 1 house in 3 is a single family residence. In Sacramento, that's much lower. Many of our historic districts are about 10% single family, 90% multifamily. In some cases, they're almost 100%. And the most single family residences in historic districts they're only found in a handful of neighborhoods in places like Southside Park, where they're around 20 to 25%, or Newton Booth and Poverty Ridge, 20 to 25%, 1 house in 4 is single family, the rest are apartments. Even though people think about these neighborhoods as being single family homes, again, it's because of that missing middle and multi-unit buildings, either converted or built that way, that hold more than one family, but are disguised as a single family home. Now, preservation in Sacramento worked a little bit differently than it did in LA. The people who started our preservation movement were, for the most part, people who moved in around the late 60s or early 70s. People talk a lot about the Alhambra Theater as the guiding force for historic preservation movement in Sacramento, and it was important. But it was more important to the people who founded Sacramento Old City Association in 1972. There's folks like Jim and Dee Dee Cathcart, who are shown on the right, or Bob and Roberta Raquella, who owned the house on the left. Or Susan Larson, and they wanted to buy these old houses and fix them up and turn them into housing. And they were told by the city of Sacramento, well, you can't fix up that house. It doesn't meet modern building codes. And also, you can't get a loan for that because this is 1970, they're still redlined. Racial exclusion covenants were done away with in 1967, but redlining lasted until the 70s. So they had to overcome the barriers of redlining, and that didn't happen until the mid-70s. And through their advocacies, a lot of the people who were moving in were very involved in politics, very aware of how to work the system, and were able, as they said, well, what strategy can we use to turn these houses back into homes? And what they used was historic preservation. So they got a historic preservation ordinance passed in 1977, not only allowing historic building codes, so you didn't have to bring buildings up to modern code, but also protecting homes from demolition. We talked about that demolition by neglect, and that was rampant in Sacramento in the 60s because most of the central city was zoned for high multifamily, and so the building was worth less than the land underneath it, to the point where a building with a plot of land with a building on it was actually worth less than a vacant lot because it was going to cost you money to demolish this horrible old ugly building here in order to build your new office building on top of it. So part of the emphasis of downzoning wasn't to keep people out or wasn't to reduce the production of housing, but to avoid the demolition of housing. Today, we have about 30 historic districts throughout the city of Sacramento, but almost all of them are in the central city. There are a couple that are outside. There's the Old City Cemetery, there's Oak Park along Broadway, and then there's Sacramento City College. There are a couple that are underway. The first Curtis Park Historic District is about ready to be submitted, and we're going to talk more about that at our next roundtable. But why is it that the central city is where you find all the historic districts? Is it because there isn't any historic architecture outside the grid? No, absolutely not. But once again, let's take a look at that map. Remember, the areas that were redlined are in the central city and Oak Park, and the other neighborhoods were not. Recent historic districts that were approved, places like Newton Booth, these were not the homes of wealthy people. These were primarily working class neighborhoods served by streetcars, small, modest, but beautiful homes, and missing middle buildings like this corner market in the middle of the block, or Oak Park, where this was the most recent historic district in Sacramento, I think, and it combined both the turn of the 20th century architecture with the African American history of the neighborhood as it became a neighborhood of exodus that we talked about. So the idea is to have a more inclusive history, where earlier historic districts were based more on dramatic Victorian homes. Contemporary preservation is more about inclusion and the legacy of the more recent past. Buildings generally have to be 50 years or older in order to qualify as historic buildings or associated with events that happened 50 years ago, which means since it's 2021, 1971 is the threshold. And so that's right in the civil rights era. And our most recent historic properties are places that are associated with civil rights, places associated with Nathaniel Colley, like his law office to the right, which was designed by James Dodd, Sacramento's first African-American architect, which I mentioned at the beginning of the program, also designed Shiloh Baptist Church in Oak Park, or the National Register listed New Helvetia Historic District, which is currently under consideration to be a new historic district in the city of Sacramento Historic District, which will protect the buildings further. And it was associated with Nathaniel Colley because in addition to its significance for Depression-era public housing, and it's designed by a dream team of four of Sacramento's most recognized and awarded architects, it was also originally segregated until it was desegregated by Nathaniel Colley and a group of working with him to integrate New Helvetia. Other recent properties are the one that was listed in the National Register and was going to be going to the Preservation Commission, but the commission meeting was canceled, is for the Flower Garden restaurant, which is built by an African-American restaurateur and is currently in use as the Nisei War Memorial, the Japanese-American veterans of World War II. They purchased this building back in the 50s, and it's one of the only buildings remaining from Sacramento's Japantown. So it has both an African-American and Japanese-American historic context and a mid-century architectural design. And then another building that we're looking at and hoping to get listed in the near future is the original home of the Women's Civic Improvement Club at 19th and T Street in the neighborhood of Richmond Grove, which was an African-American community service organization and boarding house that still exists in Oak Park. After it moved here, it moved to a building on X Street, which was demolished by Highway 50. But they're still active today, and their original home is still around. And then groups like Sacramento Modern, who work closely with Preservation Sacramento today, have really brought an awareness to the beauty and utility of mid-century modern buildings. And so this sort of rectangular apartment building, while it's kind of ungainly and they used to be decried because they were typically put up where old Victorians had been demolished, now they're old enough to be recognized as historic buildings in their own right. And not all of them are going to be eligible. Not all of them are going to be listed, but they're all useful housing. They are that filtering housing that isn't necessarily the prettiest building, but it's cheap because it's old. And in some cases, they are beautiful buildings in their own right and deserving of recognition for the role that they play. The example on top, as you can see, this is over on Q Street, I think, in Midtown, and the one below it is in Curtis Park, in one of those neighborhoods that people don't associate with multifamily or a mid-century, but it's a really nice example. And this is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about a floor area ratio between 1 and 2. But many of the neighborhoods that people look at and assume, wow, those are beautiful homes, the beautiful historic homes, they're not historic districts. The fabulous 40s, right in Kimbrough Tract 24 and adjacent neighborhoods, is not a historic district. And why? We asked that question a while ago. And part of it has to do with money. This is from the 2020 plan. It's an economic study of the city, or I'm sorry, the 2040 general plan update. And this was a really revealing set of maps. I'm really glad the city put these in there because they show some interesting things. Number one is that the central city, which is assumed to be totally hella gentrified and only rich people can live there, has the lowest median household income of any part of the city of Sacramento. As you compare it to East Sacramento and Land Park adjacent to it, the incomes there are double the income of the central city. Now, partially it's because there's more single person households. But if you go north Sacramento is much lower, South Sacramento is much lower, Land Park and the Pocket are higher, and then North Natomas in the upper left, almost all new construction and about the wealthiest neighborhood in the city. And then also there's also a measure of whiteness. We get the racial covenanted neighborhoods tend to be whiter. And the central city is kind of medium. It's kind of in the middle, and we can see that the racial makeup of Sacramento, while we're considered one of the most integrated cities in the country and most diverse, there's still a long way to go, and there's still a lot of not necessarily de facto. It's called de facto segregation or de facto redlining. But if you have enough de facto going on, enough accidental redlining because of gee, it's not really redlining, it's just that we like big lots, then it becomes a policy. And there's a book called The Color of Law that explains that it's not really de facto if everybody does it and there's no way around it. So how do we address some of these inequities, and what does this mean, and why are these neighborhoods not historic districts? It's because they're wealthy, because they're white, and because they're zoned single family. Now, you'll notice that a lot of those poorer neighborhoods are also largely zoned single family. So being single family zoned does not protect you necessarily from demolition. It doesn't mean that the neighborhoods are white. Many of the neighborhoods, again, take a look, the neighborhoods which are largely communities of color are also largely single family. So single family zoning didn't keep these communities out. So the question is upzoning them going to make those neighborhoods more integrated or more at risk versus the wealthier neighborhoods that generally have used their economic power to prevent demolition? Under the new rules, as you can see here, the growth is more consistent. It's more citywide, and it's focused on certain neighborhoods where the intensity of growth has always been focused on the central city and adjacent, but with potential for that missing middle housing. And so, from a preservationist perspective, I'm of the opinion that the general plan's recommendations are pretty good, and they're worth exploring and worth including because they don't damage unduly our historic districts or our historic properties. And we have a lot of historic properties outside the central city that are very eligible places and very beautiful architecture and very compelling stories of neighborhoods and communities, ethnic and racial communities, communities of color, and that are worth recognizing and celebrating and worth protecting. But they haven't been listed yet. And so that's going to be the kind of the next step, because we really don't know where the historic buildings are in Sacramento. About 85% of the city has never been surveyed. So moving forward, we may have to do, or we definitely want to do, what the city of Los Angeles did when they did Survey LA. They surveyed every neighborhood, every building, to determine where the potential historic buildings are, and then move forward to identify more of them. Now, as far as what people think, yeah, change is uncomfortable and something new and something scary. But how are they presented? Is it presented as a positive? Is it being presented as something that people can cope with, or are we being told that that, well, if you don't like change, you're just an old stick in the mud. You're just, it's always, some bald middle-aged guy with a goatee who likes to yell too much, who tries to stop all change. I don't know. I don't know anybody like that. But people defend neighborhoods because they love them, because they care about them, not because of intolerance, because of hatred. Yes, intolerance and hatred certainly exist, but people throughout the city, whether they're coming, I've seen a lot of reactions on social media and on other presentations, and people are getting very upset and angry about this, whether they live in a wealthy neighborhood or whether they would live in a poor neighborhood, whether it's a white neighborhood or a community of color, because they love their neighborhood and they're all worth protecting. So if these changes happen, we want to ensure that they don't disrupt those neighborhoods unduly. Some change is going to happen, but how do we manage that change? We've had some feedback from specific neighborhoods. The Land Park Community Association they did a webinar where they said they'd like to keep single-family housing zoning and then build duplexes on the neighborhood corridors. The problem is those neighborhood corridors are zoned commercial. And as we already know, the maximum intensity on neighborhood corridors is much higher than duplexes or row houses. That's where you're going to find mid-rises. So, and because of another state law that was passed, I think SB 30, if anyone happens to know the legislation, you can't downzone anything in California anymore. If it's zoned for a certain amount, you can't zone it for lower. So requiring the city to zone commercial corridors for less than their current zoning violates state law. So that's a serious problem with LPCA's position. I understand where they're coming from, but it may not be feasible to do so. Elmhurst has raised the point that new construction isn't affordable. It doesn't cause affordability automatically. We talk a little about that with filtering. If you demolish existing buildings and build new construction, the new construction is more expensive, not less, and it's going to take decades. So unless there's some policy changes around affordability or some very different changes in not just the legislation or the rules on how buildings are built, but the way buildings are built, because it's the materials and the labor that cost so much money, they're not going to get more affordable. And then Boulevard Park Neighborhood Association really raised the alarm for historic districts that a lot of blocks that were neighborhoods, homes, small apartments, were zoned RMX in error. And so part of what we've been doing as a preservation organization is identifying lots and blocks and locations which are being upzoned. And as I said, you can't downzone anything ever again, which means anything that's being upzoned, we want to look at very carefully. And we had 3 major points. Number 1, transitional heights between residential and commercial neighborhoods, which were established by the 2018 Central City Specific Plan, should be maintained citywide. talk about those in a moment. The city must provide a closer look at where upzonings occur, like I just said, and then a follow-up to the 2018 Central City Specific Plan, which they proposed initially reducing the maximum allowed floor area ratio increase deviations. Essentially, an applicant could say, I want more than the city says I can have, and the city could say yes or no, and they want to limit it. They wanted to limit it to 20%, and they said they wanted to look at that going forward in the new general plan, which is what's before us today. This is what we mean by transitional height. The maximum height in the residential zone is 35 feet, and it was 65 feet in the commercially zoned properties. And as part of the Central City Specific Plan, they wanted to increase that to 85 feet. Now, there was already a rule that said in R1 zoning, single family zoning, wherever it met commercial, then there had to be a transition, this sort of zigzag step shape, in order so that you didn't go immediately from 1 or 2 story buildings to 8-story buildings. And R3A, the missing middle zoning of the central city, which effectively everything is going to be now, didn't have that protection, even though there were almost no places where R1 met commercial, but lots of R3A met lots of commercial all throughout the central city. So we got a compromise. We said, we'll support that increased maximum height if we can get this step down transitions, and that was approved. So that's one of the things we're asking for, is the transitional height requirement should be a new citywide rule, and this will protect neighborhoods from being overshadowed from large buildings immediately next to them. But it means there's still room to build some larger buildings on those commercial corridors, which is really where they're needed. And also, downtown has historic districts that are dense and that are RMX. So the idea that all historic districts are single family homes or even small missing middle buildings, that's not correct either. So you can have very dense, very tall historic districts with much taller buildings in them, or places like R Street. This is Warehouse Artist Lofts. It's an affordable and market rate building in a historic building with a new addition. And across the street, we see the Carlaw, which is an apartment building that's just being finished up right now using a historic building and new construction. So they combine. But that RMX doesn't work everywhere. This is from Richmond Grove on 16th Street and V. And this is a place where the city wants to rezone RMX. What the city sees when they look at this block is, oh, these are awful. These are horrible. No one would want to live in these buildings. So we should rezone them for mid-rise. On the 21st Street corridor, same thing, through the Poverty Ridge Historic District and the edge of Wynn Park. Oh, nobody would want to live in these dilapidated old pieces of garbage, and so we'll rezone this for mid-rise. And some of you may recognize the buildings on the right. These are the 3 houses on the peak of Poverty Ridge between P and Q Street on kitty corner from the B. Full disclosure, I used to live in the middle house, and the owner of the building wanted to demolish them to build an apartment building, and we applied to have them listed in the Sacramento Register and changed the plan. So instead of demolition, these 3 houses are currently entitled to be converted to fourplexes. So they're still going to be the same houses on the outside, but they'll have 4 apartments each. And because these houses, when they were most recently occupied, they had like 6 to 8 to 10 people living in each one, it's going to be the same number of people, but they will legally be entitled to do that. And the only reason they could do that, you couldn't do that if this was single family zoning. You couldn't do that if it was R3A, because it would be higher than 35 units an acre. But because they were commercially zoned, you can do that. And now under the new rules, people will be able to convert a single family house like this into a fourplex if they keep even if it's a historic house, if they keep the exterior envelope. So again, you're keeping the neighborhood, but making more room for more neighbors. And that's really what we want to do. Deviations were a very controversial issue, and they came to light with a building called Yamane, proposed for 25th and J Street. And they was made possible because of the 2030 general plan, which in 2018, the city said they really wanted to revisit after they took another look at floor area ratio. What they said was the city may allow new development to exceed the maximum allowed floor area ratio or density if it is determined that the project provides a significant community benefit. Basically, if we like what you're doing, you can break the rules. This was proposed for an area which had a maximum height of 65 feet. The building was 180 feet, so almost 3 times the maximum height, and it was approved. So what that means, and there was a lawsuit, yeah, that was filed against this building, Sacramento Fair Planning versus City of Sacramento, and the lawsuit failed, which means the city won the right to exceed their own maximum heights or their own maximum floor area ratio pretty much wherever they want to. And that significant community benefit, initially back in 2030, the city said, well, we'll define specifically what significant community benefit is and how much more you can get. And the city's position in the lawsuit was that significant community benefit is whatever we say it is, and we can exceed that amount by whatever we want, which means that theoretically, if this deviation policy stands, if you live in a neighborhood with a maximum floor area ratio of 1, you can't expect the city to approve nothing higher than a 1. It means that if they like the cut of the jib of the developer, if they say, oh, we really like this plan, so we're going to let you have a building with a floor area ratio of 2 or 3 or 4 in a neighborhood that's floor area ratio 1, so in Land Park, in Curtis Park, in Oak Park, in North Sacramento, in Natomas, that's just fine. You just need to show us how cool you are. And so what we're asking is for that plan policy to be changed as the city staff in the Central City Specific Plan in 2018 said they would. Said, well, we want to limit it to 20% maximum. If there's a really cool benefit, we can give them 20% more. But at the time, the floor area ratio maximums were so low that you couldn't build a feasible building to that height, and asking for the extra 20% really didn't make any difference. So they said, well, we're going to look at floor area ratio in the general plan and then hopefully get rid of this policy or scale it back to a maximum of 20% instead of the sky's the limit. That's the third thing that we're asking for as a means to prevent demolition by neglect, in order to prevent speculation on land instead of buildings, and encourage the construction of housing that can certainly be taller than its neighbors, but doesn't dominate. Now, as far as equity goes, the city, as part of that 2018 Central City Specific Plan, also produced a work on gentrification and displacement. What can we do to stop gentrification and displacement? And they didn't take a whole lot out of it, but that document is still current. It's still around, and it might provide some good guidance to include in the 2040 plan update. How can we make buildings more affordable, not just through streamlining of construction, which we have done, but through other policies that protect renters and protect housing and protect buildings, as well as protecting people from displacement. I tend to be really into Midtown. I know, I'm sorry, I love it here. There are other fabulous neighborhoods throughout the city that people love and care deeply about. And the current move, not just of the city of Sacramento, but nationwide in building neighborhoods, is that a lot of these neighborhoods can and should look maybe a little bit more like Midtown. Not necessarily as a party palace, not necessarily with tons of traffic, and unlike the Central City, which has 125 jobs, or did before COVID, just within 4 square miles, even though we've only got 35,000 population. Most of the city's neighborhood are not job centers. So a lot of what you see, a lot of what are seen as the problems of Midtown, as far as traffic and noise, are not going to happen because of a few fourplexes. A lot of fourplexes, maybe, but again, that's why we have rules for creating historic districts, and why we have those setbacks, and why we have some really powerful and motivated neighborhood associations and community advocates. And sometimes they get elected to city council. Now, this is coming before city council on Tuesday, January 19th at 5 p.m. It's item 15, and you can make an e-comment now. You can send comments to the city planners. You can call in by telephone during the meeting and comment directly to city council. And whatever your position on this item, I encourage people to do so. City has to hear from its constituents, and we're entitled to be heard. Thanks, everyone. Preservation Sacramento's website, preservationsacramento.org. And our next event is our quarterly preservation roundtable, which will be held as a Zoom meeting on Saturday, February 13th. If you sign up for our email list, we'll get you details on that, as well as on other projects, and hopefully more of the fun stuff that we do, like walking tours and home tours, which may well be virtual this year, but we're certainly going to do them. Okay. So I'm opening up the questions window. All right. The the first question that I've got here is city planners at LPA indicated this land use change will not result in more affordable housing in high-cost neighborhoods. This is true. Why is the change being proposed for the historic neighborhoods? Well, it's being proposed citywide. Affordable housing means there's a couple different definitions, but generally what they mean is housing which is specifically intended for people with incomes lower than average. And right now, the city of Sacramento has no requirement for affordable housing in new construction. And so if this goes forward and the city doesn't have an affordable housing ordinance or what's called an inclusionary housing ordinance, we talked about that when we talked about infill, then there wouldn't be any requirement going forward. There is no, there's minimal rent control. There's no requirement that a percentage of new construction include affordable units. So it wouldn't be included in any construction unless that policy changes. And that's currently not part of the general plan update. What kind of loans are the FHA offering today? I don't know too much about FHA loans today, but generally I think they need to meet certain standards. They no longer include things like racial covenants or redlining, but I think it's something like 3% of the price as a down payment instead of higher. The previous slide, someone wanted to see that slide again instead of my face. I can understand that. Okay. Okay, and then who's going to help people previously priced out of the market to purchase a unit in a fourplex? That's a good question. And a lot of this affordability stuff is that's the challenge, is that these new fourplexes are not going to be cheap. And so who is going to be able to afford them if they're built as new construction? Does the city have an ordinance that any rezoned parcels will be built to sale and not for rent? And how is the city going to support ownership in high density areas and prevent a permanent rental culture? Well, that's a good question. As I mentioned, the central city is 90% multifamily, 90% renter. And a lot of the neighborhoods that we're talking about here have much higher ownership percentages. So that is a question for the city. How can they support ownership? Because if you build a large apartment building in California, it's pretty hard to make it go condo because of various laws about construction liability. But the kind of housing that is done right now as ownership rather than rental in new infill construction are row houses and alley units. Not necessarily the ADUs, the little the granny flats in the backyard, but full size houses on the rear half of properties and then a lot split so the property is offered for sale, or new row houses that are only a few feet apart. We looked at that, some of the buildings at 25th and R, or on 20th Street, the PQR project that SKK did. Those are for sale products. And so row housing is the kind of housing that you want in your neighborhood if you want more for sale housing versus rental units. Will this increase in residential unit density and population density? Is there also a corresponding green space requirement? The setbacks, the only green space requirement in new construction are those setbacks. And so the setbacks remain the same, whether it's a single family home or multifamily. No parking ratios decreases the quality of life for the existing residents and creates neighbor disputes. No argument there. People don't like not having a place to park. The question is the expense. And like I said, what we've seen is there are some of those mid-rise apartment buildings were deliberately built with not enough parking, but especially if they were aimed at a luxury customer, the luxury customers got really upset because they couldn't park their car. Even if they were barely going to use it, they want to have a place to park it. And so the follow-up to, for example, 16 Powerhouse at 15th and Q has a higher parking ratio, not because the city said they had to do it, but because the customers told the developer that's what they wanted. And if you're a builder, you want to give the customers what they want. Why am I promoting no parking ratios? Personally, I'm an advocate of not providing parking ratios because there's no such thing as a parking ratio that has a scientific basis. It's basically a guess. In my opinion, the best people in the best situation to choose how much parking they want are the builders. As I said, they're going to have trouble selling or renting properties that don't have enough parking, and so they need to provide enough. It also means that we're, as a city, really obligated to provide better public transit and safer public transit that people want to ride, which is completely outside the realm of preservation, but it's also part of what we're talking about with the general plan. Okay, where do I live in Sacramento? Which district? I live in District 4 in Midtown in the Wynn Park Historic District. Um, can I get a copy of this presentation? The Color of Law? Okay, this copy of this video is going to be posted online afterwards, so it will be downloadable and viewable. And the Color of Law is a book that's available for sale. I'll try to post the many comments and links and other associated things on our webpage and with this video. So books like The Color of Law. There's some other really good books on urban development, housing, and how to make housing affordable without losing what we love about our neighborhoods. Okay, how is Sacramento's more extreme climate being taken into consideration with this densification? That's the whole idea is if you build denser, then people drive less. Even if they still have cars, they don't have to drive as far. And if there's more people and more places to walk in your neighborhood, they're more likely to take those walking trips rather than driving. So it's not universal. You don't have to ban cars, you just have to make it easier to do other things. And that makes neighborhoods greener and cooler. There's another book, I'm forgetting the author right now, I apologize, but called Green Metropolis, which points out that New York City has per capita the lowest climate footprint of any city in the United States. And it's not because people in New York City are really environmentalists, it's because they live in places where parking is a pain in the neck. And so if they have cars at all, they don't get into them as much. So again, if you reduce parking, if you reduce dependence on the automobile, not by smashing cars or getting rid of streets or getting rid of parking lots necessarily, but by providing more density, buildings stacked higher. Okay, they're actually less difficult and expensive to cool. If you have a row of houses, part of why you find row houses on the East Coast is because buildings with party walls they share heat between the walls of the row houses. And individual single family homes are the most expensive to heat and cool for the same surface area because they have more walls compared to interior structure. So buildings stacked higher are less difficult, less expensive to cool. And that's how the city is taking climate. And actually, regarding historic buildings, there's an old saying in the preservation community, the greenest building is one that's already built. So existing neighborhoods are green. And so avoiding demolition is green because about half of what is in our landfills is building materials and smashed bits of buildings that we demolished to build new ones. So it's just like using a reusable mug when you go to the coffee shop instead of a paper cup each time. An old building is that reusable mug. What is the ethnic makeup of Southside Park, and why am I not viewing areas like Curtis Park and Holmes, Folsom Boulevard, and American River? Ethnic makeup in Southside Park is, I don't have the full details, I apologize, but it became a neighborhood of exodus like Oak Park of primarily the Japanese and Chinese community and the Latino community. And it was already very strongly Portuguese and Italian, but the Portuguese and Italians mostly moved out in mid-century. And so as you get both in Oak Park or Southside Park and then further into Land Park, there's a very strong, and still is very strong, Asian population, Japanese and Chinese, other immigrants from Asia, including India. The oldest mosque in the Western United States is located in Southside Park, mostly from people who were immigrants from what is now Pakistan. And I did include a few photos of Curtis Park in East Sacramento in some of the photos I did. I did most of these photos walking around my neighborhood, and while I like those neighborhoods too, I like to go walk in there, it's a little farther away, so I apologize for my constant Midtown centrism, but the same lessons apply citywide, even if you live in a brand new neighborhood. Another question, Can the city, county, or state incentivize property owners to fill empty rooms in existing homes? For example, pay them $2,000 per year to prove they're renting out an empty bedroom or two for 9 or more months out of the year. I picture a case study of an older couple using one bedroom out of a large 4-bedroom Victorian home, which could clearly be more fully utilized. No construction needed. Yes, they certainly could. A lot of it isn't so much incentivizing that, is that it was one of those things that became prohibited. Opening up a boarding house became illegal. And during the Depression and during World War II, when people were poor, there wasn't money for new construction, or there weren't materials for new construction due to rationing during the war, a lot of single-family homes were converted to boarding houses, or they were converted to multiple apartments in order to do exactly that. Or like I talked about, those buildings on 21st Street, which were being converted from single-family to fourplexes. But yes, you could easily rent out rooms. And it's an idea that it was an old idea that went away, and it kind of came back with Airbnb and Verbo and other opportunities where people were renting out their homes. Now, I think people, in my opinion, took it a little too far when they're buying houses specifically to be Airbnbs, to the point where in San Francisco, a significant proportion of the housing was Airbnb, and that's part of why rents spiked so much. So now that nobody's Airbnb-ing in San Francisco because of COVID, rents are plummeting because all these former Airbnb units are on the market. But I think that the idea of having a guest in your spare room has once again become normal. And because we have the tools to be able to rent out our extra spaces to people, maybe the idea of having a bunch of Airbnb properties to rent out and not having them be permanent housing is taking that good idea too far. But we can get back to the idea of taking in boarders in an extra room. It's a great idea. If there was a way to subsidize it, that'd be even better. But it's something that, if it's allowed by right, and that might take a different discussion about affordability, we could do right now. Comment, not question. In the Community Master Plan 2040 surveys, the South area, lower income, mostly people of color, were the least in favor of eliminating R1 zoning within the city limits. I think they maybe have a right to be. They're people who are going to be the most threatened if this moves forward, and if there's no measures of accountability, or measures of accountability for affordability, and measures to limit or prevent displacement. The wealthy neighborhoods they're also opposing it. Or I'm sure there are going to be people in wealthier neighborhoods who also oppose it, but they're better suited to be able to fight it. And it's the neighborhoods with the least money and the least political power that are typically hit the hardest by this. And for a long time, it was the Central City. Central City's got a lot of attention, but there's a lot of other neighborhoods that need help and attention. And this is one of those situations. Okay. What about the water damage that occurred in the high-rise in Midtown? I'm not familiar with water damage in a high-rise, so if someone wants to follow up that comment to explain more about it, I'd love to hear more. What buildings? Okay. Are the PS comments or bullet points that can be used for our own comments on the PS website? They're not yet on our website. We're going to send out a copy of the letter to our membership, and we're going to post these comments on our social media pages on Facebook. Okay. Chris Smith has asked, can deviations still occur, such as 19J or Yamani, between now and 2040, or will these guidelines you mentioned go into effect sooner? This is the plan doesn't take effect in 2040. It's supposed to take effect really the end of next year. Deviations are still allowed, and there's nothing that I've seen in the general plan to reduce that. So one of the things we're asking for is for the city to do what they said they would do as part of the Central City Specific Plan. And now that we've increased maximum floor area ratios in places where mid-rises are allowed along commercial corridors, that those deviations be capped with a hard cap. And 19J and Yamani were the only two examples that were approved of ones that were that dramatic. Very often, a deviation would be something minor. I just need 5 more feet, or another small percentage in order to make the project work. And instead of, well, I need 3 times as much as is there, so give it to me because you like my smile. I don't think that's necessarily fair, because these rules have to be fair and equitable for everybody. And right now, they're not. Another question: how are design guidelines used with this new neighborhood designation? Citywide design guidelines. Until fairly recently, we didn't have any citywide design guidelines, so you could pretty much kind of build what you wanted. Now we have citywide design guidelines. So while there are specific design guidelines in historic districts, there's citywide design that needs to get approved primarily by staff now. The city has changed the approval process to make it much quicker. A lot of developments under 200 units can be approved at the staff level. They don't necessarily even need a commission meeting. And instead of having the Planning and Design Commission settle issues regarding design decisions, they are now being done by a design committee, which is a small group. They're not public meetings anymore, and they're a group that's chosen by city staff to talk about the design of the building beforehand. I don't know how much I agree with it, but the idea is to get these decisions moving faster. And the city has done a lot in the past year to speed up those design review decisions, whereas a lot of projects that are coming through that would have taken months or a year to go through the design review process and then the public meeting process are already approved. And a lot of it, if they meet the basic requirements, they're not demolishing any historic properties, they're not exceeding the limits that are set by zoning, it makes sense to approve them more quickly. They're still public, they're still available, but it means that neighborhood associations and community groups have to pay closer attention. And a lot of it's good news. Okay, I will post then. Okay, transitory and development easy in Sacramento currently. I think it's easy. It's getting easier. Those limits, the city did do a TOD plan that was citywide a couple years ago, and that eases it. And then the stuff that I just mentioned, the expedited review for units up to 200 by staff instead of by commission, it's getting easier. Okay, and is the city proposing a return of the inclusionary housing ordinance? To my knowledge, no. There's nothing in the general plan update that would bring back inclusionary housing, and that's that affordable housing percentage where X amount of housing in a new project, and this used to be required in parts of the central city and in North Natomas, but it was done away with in about 5 or 6 years ago and replaced with a flat fee of about $3 per square foot that would go into a housing trust fund. The problem is that that amount was so small that even after multiple years, there wasn't enough money in that housing trust fund to build more than a handful of units. Okay. Has the city considered ADUs, accessory dwelling units? Yes, actually, in 2018 or 2019, the city passed regulations to simplify construction of accessory dwelling units. Those are already allowed everywhere in the city, regardless of zoning, and they would be encouraged as a strategy to meet our housing goals in the new plan. But what they're saying is that in addition to that, also would have the option to build new construction that would be as much as a fourplex. So it's a combination. It's not one answer, it's multiple answers. It's ADUs, it's fourplexes, it's multi-story housing on commercial corridors where for the most part they're mostly parking lots right now because until relatively recently you couldn't build housing in commercial zones. Had a question from someone. I live in an unincorporated areas of Sacramento, but this is of great concern to me. Do you think a letter from a non-city resident is still important? I think so. Non-city residents, everyone, this is a public process, and so everyone has a right to speak and give their opinion. It's always nice if a council member hears from one of their constituents, but even if they live outside the city of Sacramento, lots of people who live outside the city of Sacramento care about what happens because you work here, because you visit here, you have friends here, you have connections to this place. And so I always encourage people to write, even if I don't agree with their position, you really always have the right to write. Whether or not it's going to do much, that could be another question. Okay, do I foresee some of these fourplexes being converted to condos? Sacramento is mostly steered away from condo conversion, but it is a possibility. Sometimes it's a matter of the economics and cost. Sometimes buildings that were constructed with originally to be condos. If people are familiar with the Alexan Midtown or on Alhambra and T Street, that was originally put forth to be condominiums, and it was built during the housing crisis, and it was rented as apartments. And so far as I know, it's still apartments. But another building, the Whiskey Hill Lofts, 21st and S Street. Those were also intended to be for sale units built during the economic crisis of 2008 or thereabouts, and originally rented. And then after a few years and the market recovered, now they're being offered for sale. So certainly some of these could be ownership housing. As I mentioned, row houses, places where there aren't necessarily housing stacked on top of each other, but adjacent to each other, that's easier to convert to for sale housing. Okay, what are the options Okay, tenants in common is a form of ownership, like in San Francisco. I'd love to know more about that. To be honest, I don't know much. And there is much that we can learn from other cities and what they're doing. The report that I mentioned about strategies to prevent displacement included a lot of what other cities did. And so, like I said, I'll be posting that. I'll be posting links in our emails and social media for people to do some of their own follow-up, because there's a lot of documents. The updates to the specific plan updates adds up to about 1,000 pages, including the staff report. A lot of it's really tough to wade through. So I'm going to try to focus on documents where I can, where they're relatively short, or try to tell people this is where you want to look in these documents so they don't have to swim through paperwork, as I love swimming through paperwork. Um, okay. What are the options to protect areas such as Richmond Grove? Preservation Sacramento has been communicating with Richmond Grove residents for the past couple of years, and we're going to move forward this year. We're going to talk more about it at the roundtable next month and when we do our annual report, with a survey of Richmond Grove. So generally south of R Street to all the way to X Street, we're hoping, between 12th and 19th. So between the Poverty Ridge Historic District and the Southside Park Historic District is a large area of homes that are really indistinguishable from those in any other historic district, but they were surveyed in 2003. But because, again, the economic collapse upended a lot of things, including preservation staff, and we went from 4 preservation planners and a preservation director to a preservation director with 0 staff. And now we have 1 preservation director and 1 preservation planner and occasionally an intern. So we, as a preservation organization, sometimes we have enough money to do a small survey. We're not big. We weren't able to do a tour this year and that last year, and that's our main fundraiser. So we can't afford a lot. We can't afford to survey the entire city, but we can follow through with this promise, which is we're going to survey Richmond Grove, identify any potential historic districts or individual landmarks, like the WCIC house at 19th and T Street, and then endeavor to have them listed in the Sacramento Register as historic districts in order to enhance that protection. And we hope that that lesson will spread, and that idea will spread to other parts of the city that have historic properties, that have stories to tell and places to protect. Okay. Why do Sacramentans sleep on the bottom floor in the summer? Because it's cooler. Well, that's because hot air rises. Shouldn't new units be equally distributed in the various neighborhoods to provide true diversity? Yes. And that's actually the intent of allowing fourplexes everywhere. Is they're still going to have the most intense construction in the central city and in downtown. And actually, the population density of downtown Sacramento in the central business district is, if you don't count the jail, it's 1/3 of Midtown, because there are so many offices. Again, 125,000 jobs in one neighborhood. So there wasn't a lot of room for housing. And so hopefully, especially when people are talking about converting to telework, maybe some of those offices will become adaptively reused as housing, and some of the vacant buildings will be converted to housing, as it has already started. And that will bring, hopefully, but because they allow higher buildings and higher intensities, you can bring that population up to the level of Midtown if we add a few thousand units. And a lot of those are already happening, but we need to have taller building heights in order to make room for them in what's already a very crowded downtown. Okay, the conversions from single family to quadplexes by an existing owner cause a loss of Chapter 13 tax basis through revaluation, higher property tax as a result. That's a good question. I don't know, and that's definitely one that deserves an answer. But what the good news for the city is, if they are valuated as a higher level, then the city makes more money. And one thing about that fourplex is that 5 units is what triggers the higher requirements for rental housing, and it makes it harder to build because it's explicitly intended to be commercial, something that a developer builds rather than just a homeowner. And what used to happen in Sacramento and other places is, if you build a fourplex, you lived in one and you rented out the other 3. So it was intended not necessarily as a rental property with no landlord or a remote property, but your own home with 3 neighbors that helped you pay for your property. Okay, is housing for the homeless, their location and requirements, anything that your organization is interested in? We actually, to an extent, we're a historic preservation organization, so we try to avoid getting too involved with discussions outside of preservation. But a lot of our historic properties are also places where people who were recently on the street can live. I got involved with historic preservation because I was a social worker I worked in a couple of historic fourplexes in Southside Park, which were transitional programs for homeless mentally ill adults. Then I was a case manager for people who lived in downtown SRO hotels, and almost all of the downtown SRO hotels are historic buildings. Last year and the year before, we advocated in support of creating a new program in the Capitol Park Hotel, which would rehab this historic building, which was in really bad shape, as permanent supportive housing for people who are currently on the street. So we get involved with affordable housing, with homeless housing, shelters and things like that, where there's a historic property involved. And our focus is what's going to happen? Is it good for the historic property? And very often that combination of affordable housing or shelter housing and historic buildings works really well. I think that's all the questions. Okay, another question was how many people live in the central city currently and what was its historic peak? I wrote about this in my book, Sacramento Renaissance. In 1950, the population of the central city from the river to river, Alhambra to Broadway was 58,000 people. Redevelopment and highway construction dropped that from 58,000 to, by 1970, 27,000. And the era of the 70s and 80s is, again, when this group of people moved back to the central city, and many never left, of course, but started advocating for living here and living downtown. And so it rose by 1990 to 34,000. And it has been pretty steady since then. I think that in the 2020 census that's just finished, that we will see some significant growth because there's been a lot of new housing. But we've mostly been playing a holding action for the past 30 years. And that, yes, we're building new housing. The neighbors and communities have been advocating for new housing construction, but we're also demolishing existing housing. So as you saw with that equation earlier, whenever you demolish existing housing, you're taking away from the height of your new building. And so there really hasn't, the population of the central city has been stable instead of growing back to its height of 58,000. Past president of preservation of Sacramento Old City Association, William Atherton, I think was his name. He said in the early 70s, you could double the population of the central city without demolishing a single building. At the time, it was 27,000, so doubling it would have been 54,000 back to that historic high. I still believe that we can reach and exceed 58,000 people just in the central city, and we should, without demolishing any of our historic buildings. Mostly what we'd have to lose are offices that are going to be more and more into disuse as people move to telework, and some parking lots, which won't be as needed because we are commuting. And we can do it without losing what people love about our neighborhood, not just the people who love to live here, but the people who love to visit here. And the same potential for welcoming new neighbors exists in all of our neighborhoods, whether they're historic neighborhoods or new construction. It mostly is a matter of changing policies, and in some cases, changing minds. And that it also means changing the minds of planners who, like John Nolan a century ago, looked at Sacramento from high altitude without talking to people on the street. Okay, the question is, what would it take to mandate community green space in order to minimize the concrete jungle effect, and essentially losing that beautiful tree canopy? And one of the other environmental justice factors that I actually have to go see if it's included in the general plan, I've seen it mentioned a few times, is that the best health outcomes in Sacramento tend to be where there's the most tree cover. And typically that is in not all of the single family neighborhoods, but the same sort of single family neighborhoods that we talk about, the wealthy single family neighborhoods. So the way to avoid that would be, instead of saying, well, let's build high rises everywhere, and no one's really saying that, but if you build a fourplex that has the same envelope as a single family home, if you don't need concrete to cover the land for parking lots everywhere because of artificial parking minimums, then you have more room for trees, and the buildings don't the buildings aren't overshadowed. They don't overshadow the trees because they're built at the same scale as the homes that we associate with our neighborhoods. So that's how you can keep your neighborhoods and your trees and still make room for more neighbors. And we are now 10 minutes over what I said was going to be the end of the time. And my voice is shot. So I'd like to thank you all again for attending. I hope that you'll sign up for our email list at preservationsacramento.org. I hope that you will consider joining as a member. We are going to have some more members-only events this year, whether they're virtual or in person, and it all goes to do the advocacy work that we have done mostly behind the scenes this year, but we're going to try to do as much as we can in public. And if not, sign up for our email list, follow us on social media, and do provide your comments to City Council this Tuesday. And ideally, one other hint when it comes to contacting City Council, find out who their staff representative is, their chief of staff. And all of this is on the City of Sacramento's website, cityofsacramento.org. So send an email not just to a City Council member, but to their chief of staff, because the chief of staff reads all the emails and the council member might not. And then also send it to city planners, because the planners want to know what you're thinking. A lot of the people who are in the planning department, they really do care about neighborhoods. They care about the opinions of the community, and they want to hear from you. So send them all the emails. All right. So thanks, everyone, and goodbye.